Hello. Hi, my name is Alex Dodge. Welcome to Brooklyn Research. For those of you who've not been here before, I'll talk a little bit about what Brooklyn Research is. Brooklyn Research is really two things. One side of it is this, a nonprofit organization that does a range of different kinds of programming. We also do workshops from time to time. In terms of programming, this is an artist talk series that I started. This is the second season of it. In addition to artist talks, we also do a range of other media. We've started a podcast recently. And a lot of the funding for that, the main funding for that comes from our co-working space. So the co-working space that we have run by the nonprofit provides affordable space to people working with technology in some form in a creative practice generally. So some of the people here are working as artists, some as designers, some somewhat in between. There are some people who also work in a more or less entrepreneurial mode. But that's what the nonprofit space and the co-working space does. There's also a for-profit side, which is totally a separate part. Both were started by myself and my two partners, Johnny Liu and Azer Longinus. And the for-profit side does related work. We do a lot of work with artists, helping artists build interactive work, sculpture, other interactive systems for their work, and we also work with museums in different institutions. We've done work for the Met, Jewish Museum, and other institutions as well. And we also do work with larger leading technology firms as well, doing interactive systems for them as well. So that's Brooklyn Research. INTERchange. This is the second season of INTERchange. INTERchange is a artist talk series primarily focusing on artists that work at the intersection of physical and virtual spaces. And so a lot of the people that we've spotlighted and focused on have been somewhere in that spectrum, some of them working very much in the virtual in the way that we think about virtual as being virtual reality. There are people who have that we've had to speak about their work that are working within that medium and that sort of realm. And then there's other people that are primarily physical media artists, but use a lot of digital and virtual tools to in their process in making their work. And it's taken this long to finally have someone here to talk about their work that's working primarily in sound and music. And this is something I think that is really of primary interest when we think about virtual space, especially when we think about levels of mediation. I think that when we talk about virtual reality, there's an incredible barrier to both create that media and also experience it. You have to have highly specialized prostheses to be able to enter into that world and to be able to experience it. And I think that one of the things that is so powerful about music is that it is one of the least mediated forms that we interact, that we can experience. There's very little that we have to ask of it to be able to experience it. Maybe more that we have to, depending on how you're creating music and sound, those tools can be more complicated. But as the experiencers, as the viewers or listeners of sound and music, it's one of those forms that is so accessible, in generally speaking. I also want to say that when we're building work of various types, I often believe that true innovation can be known when we. I think that innovation sometimes starts within confines and limitations, and then I think when we push against those, we oftentimes realize that that new tools are necessary, and we either grab the tools that are available to us, and then oftentimes we have to build new tools and new instruments to be able to create that work. And this is something very much in the case of Merte. Merche Blasco, who's our speaker tonight, builds a lot of her own instruments and uses those in her performance and in her compositions. I met Merche first at ITP, the Interactive Technology, a telecommunications program at NYU, and immediately was, impressed and blown away by her practice and her work. She's now a PhD candidate back at NYU in musical composition, and doing incredible performances that I've been lucky enough to see this year, at least one of them. So please give Merche a big welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to the whole team of Brooklyn Research and to you all for coming here. And it's very special to present this work here because a lot of these pieces actually started in this space. I used to come to Brooklyn Research to produce my work, so it's great to be back, and thank you. And I frame the pieces that I wanted to present today exactly in that space that Alex was talking about. And in these two different areas that I've called artifacts and notation system, and where I see my work is dealing with this relationship, this dialogue, this tension of this virtual space that I'm creating, meaning the sonic space, the pieces, the sound pieces that I'm creating, and the more corporeal physical space where I stand, where my body stands, and in relationship to the rest. And the first, and some of the projects will bleed between these two areas, as you will see. And the first area that I called artifacts, it comes out from frustration that I started feeling when I saw that all the potential that I see, the expressive potential that I see in electroacoustic sounds and electronic music, there was a big gap between that and the artistic possibilities in there and the tools that I could use to perform with it. And here, I need to say that I see myself as a composer, performer, and improviser at the same time. So when these three things are happening together, it's very important for me, the tools that I'm using or the instruments that I can use to actually create those sounds. And I approach music in that way, in a very embodied cognitive way. So the sounds that I'm creating are very related to how am I communicating with the physical world, how I'm moving around, the gestures that I'm doing. And so that's why I started building my own artifacts that could enable that way of doing music. There's also, especially in the United States, a trope of audio technologies that are being inherited from military purposes. So there is, like all the technology that arrived to us is scripted in social structures and power dynamics that are related to the places where they are created. And so they usually, there's a problem with me when the tool that I'm using, it's meant to be, or it's scripted in terms of power, control, and efficiency. Like it's the same tool that I use to write the most boring email or to do an Excel. Like it's the one that I'm supposed to use to create these sounds. Like there was a gap in there that I tried to fill and to offer an alternative paradigm that represents more the way that I think about sound and sound creation and performance. Okay, so artifacts. So the first instrument that I'm going to start to talk about, artifact, it's called Lobatus, and it started with the shape. And it came out from the idea that I wanted to play with the phenomenon of beat frequency effect, which happens when you have two sine waves that get really close to each other, and there is a third tone that starts beating coming out of that. So this, in my head, it was all about a very fine little difference of these tones getting closer to each other. There was something poetic to research about that, or that I wanted to explore, and that from this little difference came a much more radical, like aural response or sonic response. So I turn into ceramic as the material because ceramic is something that you usually manipulate with care, and that that you approach, with care. So that would kind of like call to these small gestures that the performance or the sound quality that I was looking for would imply. And then I created these different 3 voices. There are 3 different voices of that are being used in this additive synthesis process. That is how this sound is created. And I have to say I created these pieces with INTERchange. And then I embedded, so basically these 3 pieces are 3 rotary sensors. And I also wanted to experiment with like the usual gestures that are embedded in the commercial devices that are like the use when you're turning a knob, expanding a little bit that gesture and transforming a little bit that gesture and see what happened. And then, so that's the 3 ceramic pieces, and then there are 2 light sensors embedded that are calling for a much more dramatic gesture that is affecting the sound, shaping the sound in a different way. And these sensors are reacting to the light conditions, usually of lights that I'm holding in my hands, but also the light conditions in the space. And one important thing about these artifacts that I create is that I also approach technology versus, like in a much more, I try to see it as a much more collaborative way, and I give agency to the system that I'm creating. So sometimes the system gets out of control and is taking agency on the stage, and I'm very much looking forward that, I mean, not when it goes completely wrong, then it's awkward, but like I like when the technology and the system that I'm building is pushing me to an area of improvisation that I wouldn't arrive myself. So I see much more as a collaborative process than what I felt before when I used to do, like in previous electronic music projects, where the exciting part was preparing the performance, but then when I was performing, I felt very much the technology was in control of the performance, and I was just like pressing buttons and thinking about cues and following that, but not really enjoying and not really listening what I was doing. So a lot of these things is about creating a listening practice for myself and reacting to that. And these are close-ups of the ceramic pieces. And after performing with this for a while, I created this second skin for the instrument because I was missing a little bit and I wanted to combine a more, I realized that basically I had like a big, sort of like turntablism system. And also that's one of the gestures that we usually attach more, we see more often attached to electronic music. So I wanted to play with that. And I built this other skin to process field recordings. I always do field recordings. I carry a recorder with me, and I have a big collection from that dates back a while ago. And I like to, that's usually the raw material that I use in most of my performance. There's also additive synthesis and digitally processed sounds, but there's a lot that comes from field recordings and for sounds that have a personal connection. So this instrument in this shape, it's applying different granular synthesis process to these field recordings. And it's also combining this like turntablist gesture with the, again, with the light sensor that is more, if you want to call it like a optical theremin type of. These are close-ups of the 3 different voices, and these are all related. Like I designed them and I printed them, trying to match, first giving myself a more interesting texture. Like I like to be interacting with materials that are interesting to me, and a lot of them more in the next instrument that I'm going to present, or artifact, they become the score itself, like me exploring with my hands or with my body, those materials becomes a little bit the score. But they also represent the type of process that they are applying to the sound. So it's a both visual cue and tactile cue for me. I'm presenting all the instruments that I'm going to show in a video, so bear with the whole description for a little bit. And this is an artifact that I call Espongina, and these are 2 wooden balls that I fill with water. And the sensor system here is very simple. It's a waterproof piezo that is basically just measuring the vibrations and the movement, the physical qualities of the water that is inside, but also the vibrations when I'm touching the wood, and also because these wooden pieces are standing on a stage that is also vibrating with the speakers that are coming out on the stage, with the sound that is coming out on the stage, the whole instrument artifact is reacting to the vibrational conditions or to vibrations that are happening in space. So there's a lot in here of fight with me being like trying to be still when I want to control it, and it's a very, I don't know, like corporeal fight that is going on stage that I enjoy. And then I think this is the last element. This is something that I've been developing throughout the years, and it's a piezoelectric color, and it's a color that I usually wear on top of my vocal cords, and it's made of this piezoelectric material. And the piezoelectric material, it's a type of crystal that generates voltage with mechanical stress, so it's basically amplifying the vibrations also of my vocal cords. And I also use it sometimes to amplify the textures of the ceramics or other of the elements that are around. And I think now I'm going to play the video. Yes, so this is a performance where I'm using all these elements. It was performed in La Mama, and there's also a part where I'm crouching on the floor and I'm using I'm repurposing a broken fan, a broken blender, and a toothbrush, electrical toothbrush, and I'm basically using a pickup coil to amplify the electromagnetic activity of these devices. So I should say that and all the videos that I'm going to present today are usually like very edited version of what is usually a 25 minutes performance. And the next artifact that I wanted to talk about and that I actually brought here, this is something that I did this last summer when Sybil Kempson, a playwright, invited me to one of the 12 Shouts to the 10 Forgotten Heavens, which is a 3-year iterative performance that has been organized with the Whitney Museum of Art. And Sybil Kempson's work stems from a deep research in history, mythology, art history, metaphysics, and ritual. And this performance, this is a series of performances that is doing every solstice and equinox for 3 years. And this happened the 21st of June in the last summer solstice on a boat between 6 and 8 a.m. in the morning. The performance, the boat started in 21st Street in the East River, went around the island of Manhattan. We arrived to the Whitney, we waved to the Whitney, and then we kind of like circled back the island and came back to the first place. And what Sibyl asked me, well, I'm going to read in her words, like, what was this experience, what was the performance about? Aboard the ship, we will view the island city of Manhattan from the water, framed as a maritime and waterbound existence. Today, we can access a revision, a reseeing or seeing again of this island, a lost city refound, revised as an advanced ancient civilization. We take a journey for the chance to be able to see it, to see Manhattan as Atlantis, a hidden society that is not always visible or animate, but today it comes into being and delivers us mystical messages full of esoteric knowledge. So basically what she wanted me to do is, or what she asked me to impersonate is a citizen of Atlantis. And there were different collaborators for that performance, and each of us were supposed to bring one of the aspect from Atlantis that we wanted to communicate to Manhattaners, to share with them. So in my case, it was like, what were the sounds like in Atlantis, and what were the instruments that we used there, not just to communicate among Atlanteans, but also among other species, and mainly underwater species. So there were also another set of keywords that we were discussing, and that influenced this work, that had to do with other natural elements as wind. There was also a conversation of using voice and creating some sort of ritual around the voice. I was in charge of doing a purification water ritual, so I had to use whatever I built to purify 3 pitches of water that then were returned to the Hudson River. And I used, for that, I borrowed from her, from Sibyl, a set of, I don't remember how many, a set of tuning forks tuned to the solfeggio frequencies. So all that kind of like influenced the creation of this work. And after having this conversation with her, I went around New York to look for inspiring objects or textures or things that I could work around. And I found this thing in the Garden District, which is, by the way, where I find most of my stuff. And I mean, it immediately, like, I saw it, and there was a sort of like love at first sight, because I mean, for the, like, it has I mean, it's a gorgeous piece, first of all, that I immediately wanted to touch, and that's already saying something. And then I use it in a way that I put a microphone in here, so it sound like sonic properties, and it sound like resonant cavities that I could amplify and use. And the process of designing this, it's, for example, for this performance, it was very tricky because I knew we couldn't have any rehearsal on space, so I couldn't do anything that would require technically a lot of like setup or calibration time. We would enter on the boat at 4:30 a.m., so everything had to be like switch, like plug and play, basically. So what I tried to do was mimic. I knew I had plans of the boat, and I knew what would be the lighting situation and how I would be in the performance. So I tried to mimic that in the studio, mimic where the lights were coming from and my posture on space. And I decided to use light sensors, which I find with the time that are, I don't know, they're an element that I enjoy working with, that I control to an extent, and that react, like I feel like I can still use my body to sort of redirect where the light is coming from, and I still have a control of the instrument, but there's always a possibility of going out of my hands. And I don't know. I found that it's a technology that it works well with my work process, and so I started placing different light sensors and monitoring the data on the computer and moving the piece around how I felt that it would move in the performance, and monitoring the data, placing the sensors again until I landed in a situation where I felt comfortable, and I started creating the sounds or the sonic processing that would come out of that interaction. And this is a process that is usually always coming back. Like there is the physical world, the material properties of the object that I'm using. There is the hardware and software that I'm designing. There is my body interacting with all those elements, and there is the sound. And there's like this process is continuously like feeding back each other. So even after a performance, like I always come back to the instrument and rework around it, or notice a new possibility that I could include. And it's a never-ending process, more or less. And I don't have a video of the performance itself because they're still editing the material, but I do have a rehearsal of myself improvising with this piece, and these are the videos that I created and that I shared with Sibyl throughout the process. So this is what I'm going to show. And this is the other artifact that I built for that performance. And the thought behind this was trying to build, because I had a lot of conversation with Sibyl about communication with underwater creatures and the sound of these animals. So the sound or the process behind this was creating the sounds of an underwater creature from another planet. And again, the same process of holding the piece, attaching it to different parts of my bodies, and seeing how it felt more natural for my process to embed the technology to produce the sound that I had in mind of how this thing should sound like. So you see, these are some of the pictures from the actual performance. I think this must be around like 5:30 in the morning when people were arriving to the boat. And these are, that's Sibyl herself, and then some of the other dancers, performers. These are part of there were a lot of participatory rituals going on throughout the performance. These are my fellow Atlanteans. This is, so I had two performances, and actually in the first one that I did it on the top deck of the boat, I was using the first instrument that I showed. And I was using it in this case to communicate. It was supposed to be a tool to communicate with whales, dolphins, and snapping shrimps. And this is on the bottom deck. This is the part where I'm using the tuning forks to purify the water. Okay, so the second part, also thinking about my work in like, and how my work relates to this part, this connection between this physical and virtual world. I've been using, sometimes in a very literal way, parts of the physical world to create notation systems that are usually sort of open for interpretation, and that I use to communicate, especially in not especially in participatory performance, and when I have to create a score or a piece for a set of performers to perform. Like, these are languages that I build to communicate with them, or to agree to the piece that we are all creating together. And the first piece that I'm going to talk about, it's a participatory piece that I did on the Highline with friends of the Highline and Make Music New York. And this is a part of a set of participatory pieces that I've been doing, especially since I arrived to New York. And I think it has to do a lot with how I felt during my first years here, that I felt somehow that I've never felt so alone, surrounded by so many people. And I was really struck by how isolated was the use of public spaces in the city, and how people didn't really interact at all in public spaces. So I wanted to create an experience that would bring people together in the same sort of like cognitive space, doing something together, and also be conscious about the agency that we all have as sound makers and sound listeners, and how we should interact and be respectful in those terms, and also the relationship of ourselves with the sounds of the city, and I don't know, be aware of all those things. So this piece started mainly in this location, in this amphitheater that it's located, I think, above 17th Street in the Highline. And I was really struck by this architectural intervention, and how suddenly traffic became such a touristic like paradise, and how people spend sometimes a really long time just looking at traffic and taking selfies with traffic and doing videos with traffic and sitting there. So I was fascinated by this thing that was already going on. So I wanted to use that. So I spent myself a lot of time studying the traffic and doing a kind of like chart of how many yellow cabs pass like every hour, or black cabs, or green cars, or ambulances. And I started creating a sort of score that would pair traffic events with sonic events. So, and I invited 9 singers to perform this, and then we open up to the general audience that was walking by that were invited to this participatory performance. So this is the score that I gave to the singers. So I placed them in the different lanes that the street had, and they were each of them assigned a pitch. And then the sound event, the way to time the sound events would usually be, like, if you're seeing, for example, a yellow cab, from the moment that you're seeing it appearing from your window, you start the sound event that is related to that, and then it stops when the car arrived to or passed by the traffic light in the back in front of you. And there were different sound events, like if you see a yellow taxi, maintain your nod at a constant high volume, long attack and short decay. If it's a black car, there were a lot of these events that were related to the velocity of the car. So if you see a black car, sing a continuous da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da in your note, and the tempo, it's related to the speed of that car. If you see a green taxi, imitate a bird sound, motorcycle or bicycle, laugh out loud. And then I also had two friends moving around with yellow balloons and blue balloons, and they would trigger the two main melodies that ice cream trucks uses in New York. And so it was kind of like a fight between those two melodies. And then this is the score that we gave around for the audience, and we also gave them all these little instruments that you see there, the maraca, bells, noisemakers, casisi, and the time of the sound events was structured in the same way that for the singers. And there were also events that, because we didn't have instruments for all, that you could just use your voice. And this is a video of the performance. We're going to distribute a score for you all and some little instruments. Depending on the traffic events that you're seeing through this window, you will have to react in different ways. That's how we ended the performance. It's a very subtle message. Okay, and the last piece that I wanted to present today, it's this piece called Bardenas. And this started from a situation that happened, or from something that happened in 2016. This is a location called Las Bardenas Reales that is very close to my hometown. And in 2016, I had to spend about 3 months there in my hometown, which is something that I haven't done since I was a teenager. And I was waiting for a visa approval from the United States. I didn't know if I would be able to ever come back. So there was a lot of anxiety going around these days. And what I did, I used to bike a lot and move around a lot. And I did a lot of field recordings in there. And while I was in this location one day doing field recordings, like suddenly there were 2 jets that started like coming and circulating above my head and dropping bombs in the distance. And I was in shock, mainly because I realized that I like those sounds were very familiar, and I realized that when I was at school, we would be in the middle of the class and the whole building would start shaking, and we would be like, oh yeah, they're doing military practices in the shooting range. And I realized that I never really questioned those practices, and I never really thought about it. So I started researching, and I realized that this started because of an agreement that under the dictatorship of Franco was made with the United States military to, in exchange for money, live or use this space for military practices and a rehearsal. And since 1951, so for the last 67 years, this has been the rehearsal space of a lot of the conflicts that has happened since then. So the Gulf Wars, Kosovo, Lebanon, and there has been a lot of, like, these sounds embody, a lot of the citizens around this area are against these practices because somehow they're making them as, like, complicits of these conflicts, and like, they're rehearsing here what they're doing in these places. So we're enabling somehow these operations, and even when Spain is not really involved in those conflicts. And it also, this piece especially deals with this fact that somehow myself, like, I naturalize those sounds, and I never really questioned them or thought about it. And it talks about a bigger problem that we have in Spain about not really talking about and confronting our historic memory and the fact that we had a recent civil war, and there are a lot of unspoken issues that we don't really, like, even in my family, like, I feel that we don't share. And so this piece is a lot about that. And then I started looking around, so I started looking at these mountains and this geography around as somehow the silent witnesses of all this conflict, and how they're physically have been absorbing the reverberation of all these sounds. And it's very much scripted in their shapes. So I decided to use the shape of these mountains to create the score for the piece. And I need to talk about the situation of how I imagine this performance. And I'm going to escape presentation. Okay, so this piece was premiered this year in March, and it was performed by the string quartet called the Rhythm Method. And this is the situation. This is a 360 camera that I had in the middle of the space. So the way I imagined this being performed, like, I wanted to recreate that scenario of me being surrounded by these planes around. So I wanted to use a multi-channel system, to use a specialization of sound to kind of create that scenario. And this is another component in my compositions that I've been integrating for a while, this multi-channel element that adds another layer to these virtual spaces that we're creating, that doesn't have to do just with the architecture where the performance is taking place. It has also to do with the location of the speakers and the specialization of the sound and how you can sculpt sound in space. So I wanted to have the speakers surrounding the performance and basically have the performers also surrounding, and the performance embodying these mountains that somehow are speaking back to an audience this history. So, so these are, I took 12 images and I extracted these lines, and the instructions attached to this notation system that I gave to the performers, where I'm going to shuffle these images. You are going to get assigned a random line that you won't know in advance. And you interpret the line, so time, it's going from left to right to the line. We all start together, and the length is 12 minutes, which was the length of the field recordings of the planes, the jets going above my head. And the changes, we all agreed to one pitch that they would have to maintain at their best throughout the performance. And then the changes in the line, they could choose between changes in dynamic, timbre, or rhythm. And some of the things would be, couldn't be fully isolated, because if you're changing dynamics, usually in a violin, you're changing the timbre of it. But that was the initial instructions. And these are the different images. And these are the ones that I assign in the performance. So I'm going to play like 5 minutes. Choop. if I manage to go. Yeah. So keep in mind that this is a stereo mix down, so you're not going to have the full experience of being surrounded and the multi-channel, the specialized version of it, but that's it. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Merche? I know I have one, so I'll ask. Yeah. I'll ask one. When you're setting up your pieces, how do you define the parameters, or how do you determine the parameters for the piece that you're going to be creating, so that it stays within some sort of confine and doesn't either get too chaotic or too bland? Like, how do you know what that is? Like, is it each piece? How does that?
Yeah, it's usually different in that like in every piece, and it depends on the technology. Like if it's for this one, for example, like I thought light would be something that I could kind of like keep on control, but then it was like the sun was rising up and it was like a moving thing, changing orientation, so it didn't actually turn out the way that I expected. It changes, like depending on the space, on the architecture, yeah, and the technology that I'm using. It depends on the conditions of the space, so it's very different, and the parameters are very different depending on the situation of the performance.
Is there anything you can do like prior to the performance that you can sort of help to define that to get it to where it's something that you want it to be? Like, for instance, the traffic piece that you had full control over the parameters of when people were going to, maybe not.
Yeah, but I didn't know, for example, and I was afraid for a while because I don't remember what was happening that day. That traffic would be cut, like could be cut. And I was like, shit, if there's no traffic, there's no peace. So there were things that that's why I studied the traffic in advance, and I studied the day. So I went on a Sunday, the same time where, I think this happened on a Sunday. So I went on a Sunday at the same time where the performance, I try to get as close as I can to the performance situation and then work around that. But I mean, usually, you don't have a simulation system that can give you the parameters. Like reality doesn't work like that. So it changes.
Any other questions? Yeah.
What did all the musicians said when you give them this?
What they said?
Yeah. Instead of like a...
I mean, I explained them how to kind of like, I gave them, like I didn't just give them the, like throw them the lines. And like,
did you have someone that refused to play that? Or
No. And I mean, I knew, and I chose that string quartet because I know their work, and I know they're into experimental pieces, and they're very open. And in these things, like I'm very much looking for performers that are open to collaborate, because I don't write very precise scores. That's not my working mode. Like I like collaboration, so I create always these notation systems are open to interpretation, and I look for performers that are also looking for that experience. So they were cool.
Anyone else? Oh yeah.
So this actually goes back to days at ITP, and I can't believe I never actually asked you about it, but I'm kind of curious. When you were talking, you talked a little bit about sort of a circular cycle of feedback going from body to instrument and environment, and how those things inform each other. But one thing I was kind of curious about, that was something that affected me a lot, not having much of a background in it, but your experience with code and coding. Not so much, I mean, I know that you definitely use that to some extent when building instruments, but I'm wondering, did that as a logical kind of system, as an ideology, it affect some way of looking at your creative process in any way, in terms of being able to understand a modularity in parts of a process like that, and really more of an abstract, a means of abstracting building things?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like, I think, I always think that, like, my background is very technical, like it's in engineering and then in ITP. So I think that very much, like I see my head very much divided into, like, the engineer and then more, I don't know if the artist or that's even like a fair division. But for sure, and I'm not sure if I'm capable of explaining, but it's infused in the way I process these things and how I don't know, like coding gives you a certain type of sequential and like state of mind, and also knowing the possibilities. And most of these instruments, like technically, are not complicated at all. Like they're not very heavily coded. But for sure, like knowing what is possible, like I think it opens, like it gives me an initial help and way to navigate all these aspects of how to deal with these instruments and how to build around my work. I'm not sure if I'm answering.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that especially just an approach to kind of debugging a workflow or a process.
No, of course, yeah. That happens. Yeah, I mean that happens a lot, and that yeah, like being able to isolate problems, and if I'm getting into a rabbit hole, like thinking about like all the different elements that are part of this artifact, and then how can I control? Okay, I cannot control the lights. What about vibration? What about vibration being measured through the sensor instead of this other one? What about my gesture using, I don't know, a camera or an accelerometer that I attach to? Like all these options and how to debug and build these things like are influenced by that, and knowing that these elements exist.
Crossover from technical to conceptual as well is very blurry, like where things are going back and forth. You know?
Yeah, definitely. Cool.
I've never seen your notations before, and I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how reproducible your works are, if you're interested in that, or recordable, because I know they're more experiences. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I'm not, I don't, and I'm not even comfortable like recording or video recording my works. Like I think of them as very much as unique pieces that are depending on whatever is happening at that moment, and they're not reproducible usually, and I like them. They exist that way. I record them and I video, like I do documentation because you need that to show like what's your work about and to get grants or to get like future commissions. But I'm not really interested on like doing things again or reproducing work, and I think that's why like the systems are so open. Like they're not meant to be the same performance again and again. And I'm less interested in that. Yeah.
As a follow-up to that, would you ever be interested in where you're not the conductor of the piece, where you're not the one that's in charge of how that performance is going?
Yeah, definitely. And these systems are my way to somehow feel that I'm the conductor, but I'm not comfortable with that situation. So trying to create a system that it's open and that it's taking out the agency. So I'm in control of the structure, but how the performance is going to take place, it's out of my, like I want that. Like I'm looking for that. And that's why these systems are not precise and depend on elements that I'm not in control.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Is this on? First, I wanted to say this is really wonderful to see your work like this, and these are all really beautiful pieces. And so, thank you for sharing. I wanted to kind of I see this relationship in part between this piece here that we just heard and something you said very early on in your talk, which was that you were sort of interested in the kind of the politics of the materials that you use. And while I can see it kind of playing out in some of the early pieces that you presented in this work, and this kind of obviously a very technical instrument building process, and these materials that you're using, not just the hardware sensors, but also writing all this code and knowing all the digital signal processing, and in order to manipulate these. And I can see this, you said something about the sort of military industrial complex being implicated in some of these technologies, you know,
Mhm.
just, I mean, even, and the first thing I thought of course, was the potentiometer that you used initially, and just this idea of control and all of that. But it really plays out in such a different way in this piece. And I think that this is really interesting to me, the way that this is just the concept, this idea of you being in, you know, in Spain, waiting for your visa to come through in 2016, when we're all sort of like anticipating, you know, build a wall, the Muslim ban, like all this stuff. And that this piece is so conceptually tied to physical space, you know, the land that is sort of this negotiated space between the nations, and implicated in sort of like, let's just call it, you know, sort of the United States' continual, you know, colonial empire, whatever. But I'm curious, because this is so much more pointed, you know, so much more directed towards that. And I'm wondering, where is this going? Because this feels like I don't know, it's not like a turn, but it's kind of a hockey stick. Do you know? I mean, I'm just sort of curious where you see the future in with respect to that particular piece.
I mean, actually, like some of the pieces, like this piece, for example, like happened after that. I think there is, I don't know, an interesting, like it's different versions of politics, and I think like each piece is interested on illuminating a part of those politics. Like I think in these pieces, and by creating these instruments, like the politics behind technology, it's as pointy as this direct like military implication. And I mean, this comes from a very personal experience, so I think it stands out in that way, and it's kind of like its own world. I don't know if it's hard to see, and I always struggle like writing statements or saying like I don't know, like my interest changes a lot. So there are certain elements that are definitely defining my work, but I don't see like a linear line or like this piece, like a lot of times like one piece leads to another one, but I'm very dispersed. Like I'm changing, I don't know, like if I'm changing all the time, my identity is changing all the time, my work is going to change all the time. So it's really hard, like when I have to write an artist statement, I'm like, I don't know. Like I had to rewrite it like 10 times, and I keep on rewriting and rewriting, and I feel uncomfortable with artist statements in general. I don't know. Like I think or I like to think that the critical view is always there, no matter like which piece is coming out from, but there's not necessarily a continuation of that. So I'm not sure, if this is leading to a different path. Like I think they're all like parallel paths that have sort of like the same perspective or a similar perspective or point of view, but that point of view is also changing, or my area of interest is changing. So.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, feel free to hang out. We have some beers and some totes and things in the back, and come up and talk to any one of us.